Melbourne, and he's just joined us. He'll also be participating in the exercise that follows this. So, see if this catches up, maybe not. Right, so this, as I said, is an introduction to Uniclass, and it's specifically going to look at what Uniclass is and also how that interacts with the water industry and the water sector in general. There's three parts to this, looking firstly at Uniclass and how it came about. Then part two, I'm just going to talk briefly about Uniclass, the water sector, and was it working? Work that's been done to try and improve it. And finally, looking at how those improvements have been made. Before I go into that, I probably should just say a little bit more about who I am. So I work for the National Building Specification, or more commonly known as NBS. We're actually based just down the road in Newcastle. And we have within NBS a classification team that specifically deals with all matters classification. That's led by my colleague Sarah Delaney. She's our head of classification. And under that, we have a classification team, which is a group of construction professionals, essentially. That includes some architects, some engineers, and we have a taxonomy specialist who's dedicated full time to classification. I myself sit in that team. I'm from a civil engineering background. I spent many years working in the industry prior to working for NBS, and I represent, I'm the technical lead on civil engineering matters, and I sit on this Uniclass team within NBS. So that just sets the background. So you might be wondering, or some of you might be wondering, what is Uniclass? And I had to think about this just the other week, and I thought, well, it's probably best going back to first principles, actually. So I'm going to twist that slightly and say, well, what is classification? It's quite simple, I think. But I looked and had to think about what some of the definitions are for classification, just so that we're all clear on that. And at its most basic level, it could be described as a way of finding things. That's pretty good. That applies to what we're going to be looking at today, so we can go with that. But if you want something a little bit more scientific, a classification is also a systematic distribution or arrangement. That's also good. That also applies. But I think the best definition that relates to what we're going to look at today and the impact on the water sector is this one, which is that classification is just a means of structuring information which makes it easier to find that information and crucially share it. And that, I think, that sharing element is probably part of the driver for what we're all gathered here today in order to, to look at that. So as we go through this next session and into the workshop, I think it's useful for everybody to keep that clear definition in mind, at the back of your mind if you can, that classification is just a means of structuring information and finding it. And the reason I say that is because a large part of what the water sector does is related to asset management. And we're acutely aware that you have an awful lot of data management to deal with, to think about different systems, different software methods, and it's actually quite a big beast. So it's important to stress that classification is one little part of that and can be helpful, but it's not the overarching solution to everything that you might be facing. So bear that in mind as we go through the rest of this session. See if it catches up again. Okay, maybe not. So moving on to Uniclass. Uniclass is a classification framework. And considering how did Uniclass come about? Well, classification is not new to construction or to asset management. The need to classify things has been around for a good part of the 20th century. And there were moves afoot to try and make things a little bit easier to follow, particularly in the 1980s. So by 1987, it had been decided to create what was known as the Common Arrangement of Work Sections, or CORS for short. That's a classification system. It's still very much in use today, and it's liked by the people who use it. It's slightly limited by the fact that it's very much paper-based, as you can imagine. In 1987, techniques and methods weren't perhaps what they are today. So by the early 90s, when things were becoming a little bit more, dare I say, digitized and a little bit more efficient with frame of reference to computerization and things, it was recognized that there were many different methods of structuring information. And as a response to that in 1997, a group of industry professionals came up with the Uniclass framework, and that was the first incarnation of it. Now, in 1997, Uniclass was still technically a paper-based classification framework, so it had limitations too. And by the sort of end of the 90s and coming into I was going to say the new century, it's not really new anymore, we were seeing obviously increasing 3D CAD, use of modeling, and that created a need for a congruent, unified classification. So what that meant was that in the earlier part of the 21st century, there was a drive to create Uniclass, what was known as Uniclass 2015. Uniclass 2015 was published in 2015, which is why it was called Uniclass 2015. It's since been taken back to just being referred to as Uniclass. So when I talk about Uniclass, or any of the others talk about Uniclass, or you hear the term Uniclass, we're referring to Uniclass 2015. Uniclass 2015, or Uniclass as it now is a classification for managing information across the asset life cycle, so its whole life cycle stuff, which takes it a little bit beyond what was available before. It's originally developed by the UK government. They have ownership of it. NBS's involvement has been as sort of stewards and on the management side of that classification framework. But it's important to stress that Uniclass was something that was industry-wide. It was developed by various different industry groupings. So, for example, the RIBA were heavily involved, the ITE and the RICS were all involved in the run-up to 2015 in the process of developing this new classification framework. It's also structured in accordance with ISO 12006 Part 2, which is, and I always forget this, Organisation of Information about Construction Works. Now, perhaps one of the most important things in that is to bear in mind that ISO 12006 is an international standard. So Uniclass, while it was developed for the UK government, is to be used internationally. It has an international dimension. So looking at part 2, did Uniclass work for the water sector? So we had Uniclass 2015 in early sort of, 2015, 2016. We at NBS were looking at the Uniclass framework that had been developed and thinking to ourselves, how have we got in this classification suitable provision for the water sector? The Uniclass framework is dynamic, so it was designed and set up to be something that could be updated. That's important because obviously we know, particularly in the modern age, that the industry, construction, water, asset management never stands still. There are always new products, new techniques, new methods. So Uniclass was designed to be something that could flex to allow for that. So a short time after it was published in 2015, certainly at NBS, we had the feeling that perhaps the Uniclass offering for the water sector was patchy at best and maybe a little bit incomplete, if we're being honest. And we also knew that we were having quite a lot of involvement with UK water companies in particular, but it was very much on an ad hoc sort of piecemeal basis. We were dealing with, for example, Northumbrian Water, Yorkshire Water, other water companies, where we would be getting requests for information, good requests, and we would be making additions to the table. But there was no kind of overarching approach to how that would fit into the tables, into the Uniclass tables. So what did we at NBS feel needed to be looked at? This was a sort of key question, because if you're going to make a large intervention in the Uniclass classification, you need to be sure that what you're doing is responsive to industry. It's no good at us adding things in and finding out later that they're not either useful or wanted. So there was a number of things that had to be considered. First of all, we needed to have some understanding of how the water sector was using the Uniclass classification, or perhaps in some instances not using it at all. We needed to get a feel for what that was looking like. We also wanted to understand what the aspirations of the water sector were. We knew that there was a large amount of asset management and large amount of data management that was really required. So it was kind of understanding how Uniclass might fit into that on the broadest sort of level. And what that meant was that we sort of felt from an NBS standpoint, the feedback we were getting was that what we needed was a more holistic approach to the Uniclass hierarchy and the various tables. Now, just before I move on, a very brief aside. I'm not going to go into too much detail at the moment, but when I talk about the various tables in the Uniclass hierarchy, Uniclass is a hierarchical classification. Greg from Melbourne in Australia is going to go into more detail on this a little bit later on with specific reference to the water sector. But on a very broad level, Uniclass deals with classifying things at a low, small level, all the way up to things that are quite big. So for example, something like a pipe or a pump would be what we call a product in Uniclass. And above that, you have systems, elements, and so on and so forth, all the way up to things called entities and complexes. So an entity might be something like a pumping station, just to give you a little bit of an insight into that. As I say, Greg is going to touch on that in a bit more detail a bit later on. So could improvements be made to the classification, to the Uniclass classification? Well, it's going back a few years. NBS were already liaising with BIM4Water. We were already having contacts with the various task groups that existed at that time. So there were discussions ongoing, and it was decided within BIM4Water in 2019 even, that they would set up a water industry classification, hierarchy and standardization group, which is a bit of a mouthful, so we tend to refer to it as WICS. So WICS came into being, and there were monthly meetings at that point between a number of UK water company professionals, NBS, one or two other attendees. But as I mentioned earlier, Uniclass is an international classification. So a short time afterwards, it was recognised that it would be beneficial if there was some international input on this. And that's when, short time after, the Water Services Association of Australia came on board. So in terms of the collaboration that then proceeded, this was through the pandemic, there were regular meetings to review the current level of information in the Uniclass classification, and there have been some updates initiated into the tables along the way. My colleague Sarah Delaney is going to talk in more detail as a bookend to this session about the processes that go on in order to update the Uniclass classification. And she's going to look at some live searches if the technology permits. We were having regular meetings, but we were also mindful that in order to drive adoption of Uniclass, we would need to be making sure that we were using water industry standards to build confidence. So it's no good talking in a language that the industry doesn't use or isn't using. So, for example, we referenced heavily the water treatment handbook, which we knew at the time certainly Yorkshire Water have used over the years. And there was a drive to manage complexity as well. So across these two organisations, WICS and the Water Services Association of Australia, you have many professionals. There was a core group set up to drive towards producing some sort of reference document, which now exists. Claire referred to it earlier, as an output to some of the work that was going on. So while that was taking place within the realm of water, NBS was also participating in other improvements at a broader level to try and, again, improve uptake, improve awareness of the Uniclass framework. So the government and industry interoperability group was set up in the last couple of years, and that overarches everything to do with Uniclass, government-led. And also the UAB, or the University Uniclass Advisory Board, which is very much focused on improvements to the Uniclass tables. Again, that makes sure that it's industry that's driving the positive changes that go on in there. And on a more practical level, in the last couple of years, we've had new Uniclass tables published, and also, perhaps most importantly, a new website for which NBS have had quite a bit of feedback, quite a bit of positive feedback. It is easier to use, it is easier to find things. And I would stress, I'm sure there's a group of people in here who are familiar with the Uniclass website. There may be some who have dipped their toes, and there may be one or two who haven't even been on it yet, but I would strongly recommend going to the Uniclass website when you get a moment, because there's a lot of information on there about how Uniclass works and also how it can be used in order to further your work, basically. So I'm going to hand over to Greg and James now, but just before I do, to summarize the main points of this kind of introduction, Uniclass is a classification for managing information in construction and asset management. It's probably the asset management thing in here that's particularly pertinent. NBS remains focused on improving the Uniclass offering for infrastructure in general, and we'll continue to work to make improvements where they're needed for the water sector. And a number of improvements have already been introduced to make it easier to use for people with a water background.